So, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this seminar of the Better Policy Project. Today, we have Anna, who's a level one student at the Global Forecasting School that is going to be applying the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy to the United States. So, before I explain that, maybe we'll just take you through a brief tour of the Better Policy Project website so that you can understand what the prudent risk management approach is. So, if you're interested in state of the art monetary policy frameworks, this is the place to go. FPAS Mark II, we've completed a book last year when we launched the prudent risk management approach in Armenia in January of 2024. So, if you're interested in learning more about it, but Anna, please tell us what Not the Teal Book is, and why you're worried about high asset prices.
Oh, hi, Doug. Thank you for the introduction. So, hello, everyone. I'm Anna. I've been part of the Global Forecasting School for almost 3 months now. Well, with regards to my background, I have a bachelor's degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from Charles University. I recently graduated. And so I can just go into the Not the Teal Book, as Doug mentioned, because a few weeks ago we were doing the summer school, and over the 3 weeks of the summer, this document called Not the Teal Book. And it's a very fun exercise where we think about how we can take the monetary policy framework called FPAS Mark II and apply it to different non-FPAS and FPAS Mark I central banks and what it would look like. So today I think I'll be presenting about that. Would you like me to start the presentation, or if you have any other questions, Doug?
No, I think that would be perfect. So yeah. Please proceed.
All right, so I'll just share my presentation real quick. Okay. So, for context, a few of us are now actively working to achieve level 1 at the Global Forecasting School so that we can be considered for joining the production teams in December and March. And to achieve level 1, we all need to complete this Not the Teal Book exercise. As I explained it, the Not the Teal Book is where we implement FPAS Mark II to the context of, in this case, the United States. And of course, this begs the question of what is FPAS Mark II? Now, FPAS Mark II is the second generation of forecasting and policy analysis systems. As you may or may not know, Mark I was initially introduced in New Zealand to aid the process of inflation targeting. New Zealand's early experiment with inflation targeting, which began in 1989, came at a very high cost because it lacked a fully developed framework to balance trade-offs. So they had an aggressive monetary tightening in the early 1990s, which was successful in crushing inflation, but it did so at the expense of real economic stability. For the next 4 years since the start of inflation targeting, GDP was stagnant, unemployment soared into double digits, etc. So the idea here is that doing inflation targeting without a framework was very costly for New Zealand, which is why in 1998 they implemented FPAS Mark I. Similarly, FPAS Mark II was first implemented at the Central Bank of Armenia to help the latter deal with its own set of challenges. Specifically, the early 2020s brought successive crises. So COVID disrupted supply chains, labor markets, and weakened demand. And these challenges were compounded by the 2020 military conflict, which caused significant human and economic consequences. And together, the pandemic and the conflict highlighted the uncertainty that Armenia faced and the importance of having a framework that treats monetary policy as a risk management exercise. In this context, FPAS Mark II can be defined as prudent risk management, where the central bank seeks to take the path of least regret to avoid falling into dark corners where inflation expectations may become unanchored. In fact, if we look at recent Fed communications, we can see that they're already working in a way that is consistent with FPAS Mark II. For example, Michelle Baumann warns about labor market fragility and the risk of falling behind the curve, whereas Jerome Powell talks about balancing tariff-driven inflation against risks to jobs. And these conversations are very much reminiscent of adversarial collaboration, which is a part of Mark II, and it's encouraged that policymakers engage in these types of interactions. But what's missing, however, is a formal structure to their scenarios, and that's what we're trying to achieve with the NTTB exercise. 1 second, sorry. Okay, so because risks and uncertainty can have very diverse sources, it's important to illustrate the concerns that policymakers have in a structured manner to avoid communications nightmares. And the way this has been done at the CBA is by implementing the taxonomy of scenarios. So the different concerns that the Fed officials might have would find their place somewhere within this taxonomy. Here we have two broad categories. Case A type considerations refer to situations where the path of the policy rate needs to be higher than what is priced by financial markets. This involves cases of expansionary demand or contractionary supply. And we also have case B type considerations where the path of the policy rate needs to be lower than what's priced in the markets. And this includes contractionary demand and expansionary supply. Now, what are the specific case A and case B type considerations that the Fed officials have expressed? So Governor Daley has taken a firm stance by supporting the 50 basis point reduction in the policy rate. And she has also suggested that this cut is well overdue and that it should have been done back in July. And of course, this case is supported by the fact that the payroll data have been significantly revised downwards. So only 22,000 jobs were created in August, which is just historically very low for the US. And if we look at alternative measures of employment growth rates coming from the establishment survey and the household survey, respectively, we see massive discrepancies between the two measures, but both tell the same story, which is that the labor market has evidently been softening, and this was accompanied by the decline in the labor force. Similarly, Vice Chair Baumann has argued that the labor market is extremely fragile, which naturally poses the risks of falling demand, potentially a confidence crisis. And in this context, she's arguing that the Fed has fallen behind the curve, which of course would justify further rate cuts consistent with case B. However, as part of FPAS Mark II and the idea of prudent risk management, we recognize the dangers of sticking to a single narrative and ignoring measures of underlying inflation. So looking at core sticky price inflation, for example, would be very, very insightful because this measure essentially describes the behavior of the price setters where prices are set infrequently, which can serve as a proxy for inflation expectations. Because if these price setters believe that they might be entering an inflationary environment, then they might start raising prices before evident signs of inflation because they don't want to fall behind. So we're seeing that on a 3-month over 3-month basis, this measure has ticked up to about 3.5%. And if it remains at such an elevated level, we might begin to see increases in the year-on-year rate. Because what's consistent with the 2% target for PCE inflation is a 2.5% core sticky price inflation. And in this context, assuming that tariff-related inflation will be transitory is particularly dangerous because in the memory of these price setters is the very recent history where the Fed assumed that COVID-related inflation would be transitory and ignored measures of underlying inflation. What happened instead was that inflation turned out to be persistent, which potentially had negative effects on the credibility of the Fed. So given this recent history, one might argue that the Fed's credibility is already very vulnerable. And if they continue with the narrative that inflation is transitory and it turns out to be persistent, then inflation expectations this time could become unanchored, potentially pushing the US into a situation where reducing inflation would require a substantial rise in unemployment. Okay. So we would also expect a correlation between core sticky CPI and wages, since wages are also set infrequently. Therefore, a good measure of wages should reflect its interaction with prices. The data we're examining here doesn't fully capture Daly's perspective. She looks at other wage measures, including hourly earnings and the employment cost index, which are running at lower levels. But the idea here is that one cannot focus on just a single set of data while ignoring the broader picture. And as I mentioned before, this is especially important given the recent episode in 2021 when inflation consistently ran above the target. So this necessitates a framework where we look at a number of behavioral indicators for assessing potential sources of risks. If we step back and look at these Fed debates, they're really focused on the inflation-employment trade-off. And this makes sense given the nature of the Fed's dual mandate. But under FPAS Mark II, policymakers would be encouraged to think more broadly, weigh all kinds of risks to be able to choose the policy path that leads to the least amount of regret. In this context, what's missing from the conversation are equity prices and the fact that the US is currently facing the biggest asset price bubble in its history. Initially, the presence of this bubble could seem a bit counterintuitive because it was expected that because of the lockdown, equity prices should have gone down. But as we can see here, monetary and fiscal stimulus was so aggressive that it drove real 10-year interest rates into negative territory, and that fueled a massive asset bubble. Since COVID, the Nasdaq alone is up about 200%. And all the credit flowing into the economy was what boosted consumption, which is why people have been predicting a recession for years, but it hasn't arrived. And to put that into perspective, from the end of Q1 2020, we've seen an astonishing $70 trillion increase in asset values, most of it concentrated in financial markets or financial assets. And this is important because a cut in the policy rate would then signal to the markets that the Fed is ready to support even higher equity prices. So I would argue that while the Fed debates inflation and employment, it's overlooking the elephant in the room, which are the equity markets and the risks of this bubble crashing. And that's pretty much the story. I hope you liked it. Thank you, and I'll be happy to hear your comments and questions.
So thanks, Anna. That was a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to tell people that Anna and the other students will be extending this presentation this week, and we'll have another seminar on Thursday and Friday that extends the analysis for anyone that's interested. In the meantime, check out the Better Policy Project website. It has an enormous amount of information that anyone that's interested in developing state-of-the-art monetary policy frameworks might want to check out. Thank you.